Hello friends and neighbors, I'm the Scottish Reviewer, and today we are going to return to a theater reviewing series that I started, I think probably about 6 years ago now, where I review and talk about shows that I have done or been in some capacity, whether as an actor, a musician, a musical director, or in a couple of very rare cases, a member of the technical crew. Because I'm not gifted, technically, at all. Mad props to those who are. Props. The reason I chose to look specifically at shows that I have been a part of is because being a part of a show, at least for me, is a very, very different experience from just being a spectator of a show. When you spend anywhere from 3 to 6, or in one very unfortunate case, 13 weeks rehearsing a show, you get to know it a little bit better. You get to know the characters, and you get to know kind of the structure of the show, and at least for me, I gain a better understanding of the show that I'm working on when I have actually worked on it. Now, most of the time when you work on a show, you're putting a lot of creative energy into the show for a pretty long time, and by the time you get to the performance, your attitude is pretty much, you know, I'm kind of glad I did that, but I'm also kind of glad that it's over. Or, worst case scenario, this really sucked and I wanted it to be over like 6 weeks ago. However, every so often there comes a show that you are lucky enough to be a part of that had such a profound influence on you that when it comes time to perform the show, you're kind of disappointed and you wish that it could keep going. And for me, that show was Godspell. Now at this point some of you might be thinking, hasn't he already reviewed Godspell a couple of times on this channel? Well, yeah, but it was 4 or 5 years ago, nobody remembers. But yes, I have talked about Godspell quite a bit. I did it as a From Stage to Screen review, and I did it in the context of my top 10 most underrated musicals list, and I've also posted other videos that are in some way related to Godspell. It's obviously a musical that I very much enjoy and that I have a lot of passion for, but I haven't actually reviewed the show by itself yet, and that's kind of what I want to do here. But I realize that doing that is going to have me reiterating a lot of points that I already made in previous videos, and so I'm going to try to take this review in a little bit of a different direction and talk more about how Godspell influenced me personally and my own personal experience with it. For those of you who are not familiar with this show, Godspell is the story of Jesus. It is based loosely on the Gospel of Matthew. In fact, the word Godspell is an archaic form of the word gospel. So the show takes us through the story according to the Gospel of Matthew, every so often diving into Luke to get the odd parable here and there, but it does it in a very abstract way. The original ensemble was made up of 10 characters: Jesus, Judas, and then the other disciples were kind of represented by the other 8. But they're not literally these characters. Like, they're not literally telling the story of Jesus. They are representations. The story is very open, very abstract, and in many cases kind of surreal. The show was first written and performed in the late 60s and early 70s, and it kind of reflected that time period. It was a very contemporary interpretation of the gospel. So the original script contains a lot of references to some of the things that were happening at that time. But the nice thing about this script is that it is open enough that when you perform it today, you're not married to those pop culture references from the 70s, which not a lot of people would necessarily recognize. You can make up your own. Now obviously, late 60s, early 70s, that was a time of a lot of turmoil in this country with regards to race relations and gender equality and the war in Vietnam and political corruption and all sorts of stuff. And it was very much a time when the message of Jesus, the message of love and peace and acceptance of all people, was really feeling needed. Now, the show was very obscure from the start. It opened not just off-Broadway, but off-Broadway. It was a very, very scrappy sort of thing, but that was kind of part of the appeal, and the show really did gain a cult following. It was, in effect, like the story and discipleship of Jesus himself, which was also kind of a scrappy group of assorted people, fishermen and tax collectors and all that sort of thing. So something about that does ring very, very true to the Gospel of Matthew. But even though it is the Gospel of Matthew, and even though almost every line in the show is from the Bible, and it's about Jesus and all that sort of thing, I really don't consider Godspell to be a religious show. And at this point, I should probably give a little bit of personal context and talk a little bit about my own religious and faith beliefs. I don't really like to talk about religion on this channel, partially because I think it's really a personal matter, and also because I prefer to attract trolls with my opinions on things like Disney's The Little Mermaid and Andrew Lloyd Webber musicals, and not my religious beliefs. But I do want to talk about it at least a little bit in the context of Godspell. As some of you might know, I was baptized and confirmed a Christian, specifically in the United Methodist Church, and I currently work for a church as a musician and praise team director. In spite of that, though, I don't really consider myself a religious person, largely because I don't hold to a lot of the Christian doctrine. And I hesitate to identify myself as a Christian, largely because I feel like identifying as a Christian sort of implies that you're excluding other belief systems. And when it comes to matters of faith in God or the supernatural or anything along those lines, I more or less feel like most faith-based belief systems are equally valid. If I was pressed to give myself a label here, I'd probably call myself an agnostic with Christian leanings. All that being said, though, I do gain a lot of inspiration, not just from Godspell, but kind of the gospel story in general. I sort of hold the gospel story in the same regard that I hold any story that moves or inspires me in any way. It's a good story, it obviously has a profound effect on me, and I gain a lot of inspiration from it and believe in its message, but I don't necessarily believe that the story literally happened. Like, I could just as easily be describing the Harry Potter books. They also had a profound influence on me, and I believe in the message of the story, and I get a lot of inspiration from the story, but I don't go around saying that the Harry Potter story actually happened. Nobody does. A story doesn't have to be literally true in order to have an impact, and that's basically the way that I feel about any biblical story. And I really feel like that's the focus of Godspell. The focus is on the story and on Jesus' teachings. And a lot of the things that are a part of Christian doctrine, the performing of miracles, the virgin birth, the belief that Jesus rose from the dead, and the belief that Jesus was the divine Son of God, none of those things are present in Godspell. The character of Jesus, who, by the way, is never actually called Jesus within the context of the show, at least I don't believe he is, the character just kind of comes out of nowhere. He's a mysterious figure, no one really knows where he comes from, but then, to be fair, no one really knows where any of these characters come from because, you know, they're abstract concepts. But no mention is really made of his birth. There's never any indication that he's anything more than a regular, if very mysterious and very wise teacher, and the story ends with his death. Not his resurrection, but his death. The resurrection is even mentioned in the scripts, although a lot of productions do add it. And that's because ultimately Jesus, as a character, is not really the focus of Godspell, and I would actually argue it's not really the focus of the gospel story either. The show begins with something called the prologue, or the Tower of Babel, and this is probably the most abstract and sort of postmodern that this show really gets. The 8 characters in the show who are not Jesus or Judas represent 8 different philosophers throughout history, everybody from Socrates to Buckminster Fuller. They changed the philosophers for some of the updated versions, but I know the original ones best. And each of these philosophers sing their philosophies, and they all sound pretty much like their philosophies, but then at the end, they all sing their philosophies on top of each other, because they all use the same chord structure, they can do this, but the result is that you hear all these different philosophies, but they're going against each other so much that you can't make any of them out. And then John the Baptist shows up and calls on them to prepare you the way of the Lord, and they go do that thing. A lot of productions cut the prologue because it's hard, and also because they don't really understand why it's there. But it's there to sort of represent that these are 8 very, very different people with different beliefs and different philosophies, but they're all coming together under this one guy. And that's the story of the disciples as well. They all had different backgrounds, they all had different beliefs, and they all had different personalities. But the character of Jesus brought them together with one clear mission. And just to be clear, those individual personalities don't disappear throughout the show. They're still there, but they're being used toward this single end. Now, the first act is pretty much just lessons, teachings, and stories. There's not really a coherent storyline. It's just Jesus teaching his disciples things and watching as they kind of come together as one learned body. The stories and the teachings, and indeed most of the script, are taken directly from Scripture. There's not a whole lot of interpretation or spin within the script. They leave that up to the actors and the director, which is nice. The second act, then, is when the story of Jesus' passion and death really comes into play, and that's when things get a lot more dramatic. This group of people who have learned with Jesus and have come together under Jesus must now be tested. And they are tested in several different ways, and of course the biggest way is in Judas betraying Jesus and in Jesus' death. And the reason why we don't see Jesus' resurrection is because that's not really the point of the show. The point of the show is to show the formation of an ensemble, the formation of a group that came from many, many disparate parts. Jesus was the catalyst that brought this group together, and he's the one who led them and teach them, but ultimately he is insignificant in the face of what this group can now go out and do. Ultimately, this show is one big theater game. It's really kind of meta in that way, because while the ensemble of characters is coming together, the ensemble of actors also has to come together. There's a lot of trust and there's a lot of closeness that's born out of working on this musical specifically, because it allows actors from, again, different backgrounds and different beliefs and different philosophies to sort of wrestle with their own feelings about Jesus and the gospel and how things are interpreted in the Bible. It allows them to put their own spin and their own interpretation on this story. And that's one big reason why the cast that I worked with 10 years ago specifically got very, very close during the production of this show. For a while we were doing semi-annual reunions until life kind of caught up with all of us and we weren't really able to do that anymore, but the 10 of us got very, very close, and I still count all of those people, 2 of them are actually related to me, as close friends of mine. There was also the fact that we only had 3 weeks of rehearsal to put this show together, and that made the whole experience pretty intense as well. And now, of course, we've all gone our separate ways. We've got jobs, we've graduated college, some of us are married, some of us have kids. One of us has kids. Some of us have been split into different facets of our personality who review things on YouTube. Maybe that's just me. But I believe that all 10 of us still remember this production of Godspell as one of our fondest theater experiences. In fact, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Godspell might be more for the actors who perform it than it is for the people who watch it. Not that the people who watch it can't get something out of it too, they absolutely can, but I think with Godspell, in order to get the full experience of what this show is really about, you almost have to be a part of it. I almost need to put together a different worth meter for this show, because if we were talking about just watching it, I'd probably give it a worth multiple viewings, but if we're talking about performing it, I'd give it an ultimate recommendation. And at this point, I think I've pretty much run out of things to say, except to say that I still remember the production from 10 years ago very, very fondly, and I'd love to do it again. And that's my review of Godspell. If any of my fellow Godspell cast members are watching this, I miss you guys. Hope you're all doing well. And for the rest of you, see you next time. Bye now. It's me again. Hey, do you want to hear me talk a little bit about the anti-Godspell, the show that shall not be named, except I'm going to name it right now, Jesus Christ Superstar? Well, you're in luck, because I have a podcast. That's right, I am doing a podcast with my good friend Jesse Coder of Coded Lock Films. We have already done 3 episodes where we've talked about things like Hamilton and the Once Upon a Time television series and the Bones series and various other things that strike our and your fancy. And in the next episode, we are going to talk about Jesus Christ Superstar and how much I hate it. Don't worry, I'm not going to just bash Jesus Christ Superstar for the entire episode. I'm also going to bash cats. And we're going to talk about some other things too. So, if you are interested in hearing me and Jesse talk about various things that we just feel like talking about, you should definitely subscribe to our podcast at soundcloud.com/wetalkstuff. I think that's it. Or you can go to our Tumblr, wetalkstuff.tumblr.com, and check us out there. We release new episodes on the 3rd Friday of every month, unless, of course, there are technical difficulties like there were last month. Come check us out, and hope you enjoy it. And that's it. Bye now. Oh, yeah. I did a thing. Go watch it.